I want to welcome you all here on behalf of the Divestment Reinvestment team of 350 PDX. I'm Sandy Polishuk, and I'm one of the co-leaders.
And I'm Taryn Oakley, and I'm the other co-leader.
Just a few thank yous to Mia Reback, who did the staff support for this event, and for Heather Poehler, who is at our back table, King. She's also staff and helping out tonight. And Joe, anybody who is videotaping so that you can tell your friends about it, and we'll let you know when it's online and they can watch it. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the work of the divestment reinvestment team. We've spent over the summer a lot of energy in updating our personal divestment team, and this is kind of the, I guess, the final capstone of that. So after tonight, it would be great if you want to know more and see other things about personal divestment. You can go there at the 350pdx.org website /divestment, or you can click campaigns and personal divestment will show up. One of the things that we've just instituted there is a counter for people to tell us how much they've divested anonymously, and it will add up to show how much has been divested here in Portland by people who know about it. A lot of people tell me they already have, and so we want to kind of publicize that. So if you have divested, or if you do after tonight, please go there and put the amount that you divested. That would help spur other people on. There's also a place there to tell your divestment story. So that would be great. We do welcome new members on our team. We work on divestment. We've been successful with Portland, Metro, Multnomah County, and other places, some foundations. We'd like to do more foundation work, and we'd also like to start working with faith-based organizations, congregations more. We also, the reinvestment part of our name, one of the things we're most excited about is community solar, which is something that has been legal since the coal to clean bill almost 2 years ago. And the rules finally got passed, but now we found out we can't do it yet until the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, bothers to hire some staff to administer it. So they don't seem to be in any hurry, and that is actually a quote from the Portland Tribune. And we are thinking about having some fun, giving them some pressure to get going on that. So if that sounds fun to you, come join our team. Our next, there's a sign up for the team in the back on that table, as there are other things you can take a look at and sign up for, and some literature from our guests. But you can put it on your calendar that our next meeting is November 1st. That's a Wednesday. It'll be at 6:30, and it'll be at our offices, which are just down at the other end of this church on Hancock Street. That's where our door is. And there's a big sign, well, a medium sign, that says 350 PDX. And I also want to mention that the information you're hearing tonight is not no products that you're going to hear about tonight are being officially endorsed by 350 PDX. This is an informational program only, and but we're really glad you came, and welcome.
So tonight we're going to be welcoming Erin Gray. And Erin Gray works at Green Century Funds, the first family of broadly diversified, responsibly screened, and fossil fuel-free mutual funds in the country. She supports financial advisors on the West Coast, coordinates sustainable investing event participation, and leads special analytical projects. Prior to joining Green Century more than a decade ago, Ms. Gray performed financial analysis for an environmental consulting firm and worked at a public accounting firm. And joining her tonight is Bryan Brumley, who is a certified financial planner. He specializes in sustainable, responsible, and impact investing, including portfolios that contain no fossil fuel companies. He He has also been an activist for 350 PDX for several years, working with our divestment team, actually. And before becoming a financial advisor, he was an Associated Press reporter and editor assigned to Tehran, Tokyo, Moscow, Warsaw, Washington, New York, and Portland. And so if you all don't mind making sure your cell phones are silenced, and we will allow our guest to speak to us. Thank you.
Great. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming this evening. Wave your arms around. Yeah, I'll try to speak louder. We have the volume up on this as loud as it'll go. But Erin and I are a little bit soft-spoken, so we'll strain our vocal cords here. First of all, a rundown on the topics that we'll be covering. Erin, you want to run us through that?
Sure. So I think we can hit the next slide for our agenda. So we're going to talk about the various reasons to consider divestment, give you all an update on the global as well as local divestment campaign movement. Talk about the performance of some of these sustainable investments. We are talking about investments after all. And we will wrap up with sharing some resources and potential next steps for anyone interested in divesting.
Also, to let you know, there's a sign-up sheet at the back if you want to receive a copy of this guide to extracting fossil fuels from your portfolio. We'll be talking about it and running through it. It was put together by 350 ORG, the global organization, by Erin and her company, Green Century and Trillium Asset Management. So there's a sign-up sheet. We'll send you an electronic version. We've got a couple paper ones up here. So let's start with the basics, Erin. Why should people divest? And also, if we touch on any terms that are familiar to us, like SRI or ESG, maybe we could explain those along the way.
Sure. So before we get into some of the reasons for divestment, just thinking about some terminology that Bryan raised. So divesting is part of a broader investing movement, often called SRI. It used to stand for socially responsible investing. People often now refer to it as sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. There's other terms you may have heard of: green investing, ethical investing, socially conscious investing. There's another one, ESG, that stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. Some people use these terms in very distinct ways to be nuanced, but we're going to use them interchangeably tonight because essentially what we're talking about are looking at material risk factors that have the potential to impact a company's bottom line. So these can be things like a company's track record on pollution control and mitigation. What's their product safety track record? How are they in terms of adhering to labor standards? Do they have a diverse workforce? And some of the common screens that investors in this area have typically screened out are industries like tobacco, gambling, there's civilian and military firearms, and some religious investors have been investing this way for hundreds of years. So, it's nothing new. I would say the more modern incarnation of this was with the South Africa divestment and boycotts against companies that were supporting apartheid. So that was in the 60s and 70s, so that's kind of our modern version that has continued to grow until today. So I think we can jump into some of the reasons that investors might want to consider divesting. They span moral, political, financial reasons. I talked before, I just mentioned the E, S, and G factors, and when investors think about environmental issues, one of the biggest ones that we're grappling with is climate change. So it's an issue that's already here. We're not talking about trying to stop climate change. We are at best hoping to slow it down and avoid some of the worst case scenarios. So we've already seen the effects. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has gone up to 400 and above parts per million. We're seeing increased severity of droughts and floods and unfortunately this season, a lot of the devastation and destruction around the extreme hurricane and wildfire season. So there is a tremendous urgency to act now on this issue. And thinking about it from a moral or ethical or religious perspective, it's an opportunity for investors to align their portfolios with their values. So for those of us who think that climate change is a serious and urgent threat, we therefore wouldn't want to invest in the industries that's primarily responsible for changing the climate. So this isn't, kind of a new concept. A lot of us are familiar with trying to align our actions and behavior and decisions with our beliefs. So in the divestment realm, this is just taking that one step further to looking at your financial decisions and your investment portfolios. And a lot of us do this. We, recycle and compost, and we might bike or take public transit or drive electric or hybrid vehicles, or choose our diet based on our beliefs. So a lot of this is just expanding into more alignment of living your life. And there is a quote by Bill McKibben I wanted to share with you. He said, "It does not make sense to invest my retirement money in a company whose business plan means that there won't be an earth to retire on." And then the next reason you might consider divestment, and this is what we feel like the divestment movement is primarily focusing on, is breaking the influence that corporations have in our political system. So, if we think about the influence that companies currently have over creating legislation and regulation, fossil fuel companies have used this power and influence to block forward-looking energy policy. And for us, we actually want this energy policy to address established and critical risks like climate change. So a lot of it is trying to expose and break this cycle of influence and control. And on a positive note, we are feeling like we're seeing some progress here. There are some campaigns out there to expose what these fossil fuel companies knew in terms of going back decades, knowing that what impact they were having on the climate. There's the whole Exxon Knew campaign. And it's looking at how they misled the public, how they paid scientists to refute some of this climate data, all to distract us from making some headway on these critical issues. And states are starting to bring lawsuits on these issues, not only about these potential cover-ups, but also about the environmental impacts that these companies are having in terms of things like rising sea levels. And there's another, I just want to address, some people have some misconceptions about what the divestment movement and campaign is trying to achieve. It's not about trying to bankrupt a company like Exxon. ExxonMobil is among the largest companies, certainly in our country and around the world. I think they're up to about $350 billion in market cap. So it is more about, along the lines of the South African divestment movement, trying to break the stranglehold that these companies have over the political process and trying to restore some of the fundamentals of democracy and representation.
So Erin, tell us a little bit about how we might measure the impact of that. I mean, when we pull our money out of an ExxonMobil or a Chevron, we can't really see the company flinch, but what are some of the visible signs of action and rising public awareness?
Yeah, we could skip ahead to some of the updates on the divestment movement, which is where we are trying to show the broader impact. So Sandy just mentioned on the local website here, you can add your name, your voice, your dollar amount to these overall campaigns. So we are currently at almost 800 institutions that have committed to divestment, representing over $5.5 trillion in assets. Over 58,000 individuals have committed to divestment, and that's represented by over $5 billion in assets. And there are, let's see, Sandy had talked about trying to get more faith-based organizations involved, and they're actually leading the way with the biggest group of organizations that have committed to divestment, with over a quarter of all of the divestment commitments so far. And some of the notable organizations are the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. This is the family that is heirs to Standard Oil, which is now ExxonMobil. They have made no progress with trying to get the company to change some of their behavior, so they fully divested. There's the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Lutheran World Federation, which we're very appreciative of being in their space tonight. The largest pension plan in the country, the California State Pension Plans, CalPERS and CalSTRS, as well as Stanford University, have all agreed to divest from coal. And then even the Hollywood crowd is getting involved. There's Leonardo DiCaprio's foundation, and the actor Mark Ruffalo is very vocal on this issue as well.
I can add to some of the things that Sandy mentioned, and Sandy, just jump in if I leave something out or misconstrue it. I'm sure all of you noticed that the Washington Department of Ecology last month announced that it denied a water quality permit sought for the Millennium Bulk Terminals to construct and operate the largest coal terminal in the country in Washington. So that's partially a result of the actions by 350 and other activists who, when they're not dropping off of bridges and being kayaktivists, have been very effective in testifying and marching in the streets. 350 is very involved with trying to block the Jordan Cove gas export facility. With the change in the administration, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, now under Trump, is expected to go ahead and approve that, but there's still, if we pressure the Oregon Land Use Board and Governor Brown, we can block it at that level. 350, the divestment group here, has testified and appeared before the City Council in Portland and the Metro Council. We had a symbolic vote by the Metro Council to ask the state not to invest the short-term money in bonds in fossil fuels. That passed. The cities, we did have the resolution passed, but we're having to rework it, so there's still a lot of activity there to be done. The Divest Committee also includes a Divest PERS subgroup. That's a pretty tough nut to crack, but if you want to find out more about that, Heather in the back or Sandy can tell you a little bit more about it.
Sure, we could pop back a slide. I could chat a bit more about some of the other reasons to consider divestment, which are along the financial reasons. So kind of the big aha moment that Bill McKibben shared with us was the fact that fossil fuel companies around the world currently own 5 times more in carbon reserves than the Earth can safely absorb to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise that there is some scientific consensus around. And the valuation of these companies is based in part on the value of their long-term proven reserves. So if we have, as a society, decide to tax or cap carbon emissions, there's the potential for these reserves to become devalued or stranded. So, that's one part of the financial consideration. Another is that fossil fuel companies continue to spend on capital projects that are becoming more expensive and more dangerous. We see that they are continuing to test the limits of technology and safety. And we've seen this with the impacts of things like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, more extreme projects being proposed for drilling in the Arctic. And some shareholders are taking an interesting view, saying this is a waste of their shareholder capital. In 2013, the top 200 fossil fuel companies by carbon reserves spent $674 billion in capital expenditures and paid out only $127 billion in dividends to shareholders. So it's an interesting perspective, but those shareholders feel like there's potentially a better use for that capital. And then part of the reinvestment conversation is that if you're not invested in fossil fuels and you divest that money, it frees it up for investment in cleaner and more sustainable projects. So Bryan mentioned we've got this divestment guide. There's a section in here that kind of outlines a lot of the industries and sectors that are ripe for reinvestment. Things like transportation, energy storage, sustainable agriculture, and many more.
Talk a little bit about, well, we've been using the word fossil fuel-free investing quite a bit up here. And as a financial advisor, I get more and more people coming to me looking for fossil-free portfolios. A few years ago, the main drivers would have been just general ecological and environmental concerns. A lot of folks are concerned about gender issues, gender equity, equal pay, putting more and more women in executive roles and on boards of directors. So these are all issues that we deal with in socially responsible investing. But more and more folks are asking for a fossil fuel-free portfolio, and they're all different shades of product that are available. We've seen a huge influx of dollars into social investing. It's increased over 1,000% over the last 20 years. It's now over $8 trillion. About 1 out of every $5 under management in the United States has got some sort of green tint on it. But they're different shades of green. A major fund company recently issued an exchange-traded fund that it was branded as a green portfolio, but they listed the top 10 holdings, and they included ExxonMobil. That part of the presentation just disappeared very quickly. But so you need to kind of define as an investor what you want your fossil-free portfolio to look like. Do you want to restrict it to the Carbon Tracker 200, which is the 350.org formulation, which is a very elegant one, by the way, because it allows you to include some sort of side players that some folks might not like Halliburton and Schlumberger, that gives supply engineering expertise and pipeline facilities. Also, the different flavors of fossil fuel. There's coal, which very few people now believe that coal will ever be a lucrative investment again. That seems to be confined to certain elements of the current administration. Natural gas is something that has displaced coal, but it does have a lot of highly negative effects to the way it's extracted. And then fossil fuels, oil. Now, oil companies have been very badly beaten up in the market over the last 4 or 5 years. So when we start talking about performance, which we're going to get to in a minute, a lot of that is attributable to the poor performance of the oil companies. Erin mentioned stranded assets. So a lot of folks think the oil company stocks just are never coming back, although that is a risk. So Erin, if you could, if you're ready to go ahead and address the issue, how safe is it to extract fossil fuels from your portfolio? What kind of returns can you get, and are you jeopardizing your retirement or your college savings?
Sure, we can go to the slide with the chart there. So yeah, the performance question is the one that kind of comes up most quickly and most often. So the chart that we're showing here is looking at a broad-based global investment index called the MSCI ACWI, the All Country World Index, and that is in orange. And the blue line is that same index without fossil fuel companies. So this is over a recent, almost 7-year period. And as Bryan mentioned, during this period, the price of oil has been low. Essentially, there's a similar study that we've done. Question?
Yes, I'd love to ask a question. I hope that's okay.
Please
Sure,
go.
jump in.
Okay, great. So I'm just wondering, baseline, how do you determine if an investment is a fossil fuel investment, I'm thinking that there are hidden fossil fuel issues, and how do you determine that? I've already divested everything that is obvious.
Yep.
But
Yeah, so Bryan touched on the kind of definition of it before. But there is no kind of common definition among the investment industry. 350.org's call for divestment is no investments in the top 100 coal and 100 oil and gas companies by carbon reserves. At our firm, we do a lot of engagement with companies. We were engaging with natural gas companies. We realized the end result of that is to create the greenest natural gas company. And with our mission, we actually didn't think that was green enough, so we fully divested. Our definition, we figured the people who didn't want to be in the top 100 coal and oil and gas companies probably might not want to be in the 101st company on those lists. So we looked along the carbon supply chain and said no investments in companies involved from the exploration, extraction, production, and refining of coal, oil, and gas. And then we got a lot of follow-up questions. What about utilities? So we also screen out any utility that burns fossil fuels for electricity and any pipelines that transmit oil and gas. We also have no companies with carbon reserves. Bryan did mention there is, there's a quote by Morgan Stanley up here. There's products in the market from BlackRock and some of the much larger investment firms. Not all of them. So the fossil fuel-free ones often aren't responsibly screened. And we found that if people care about environmental issues, they often care about social issues as well. So, they might not screen out the GMO Monsanto producers. They might have Walmart. They might have these other companies. So it really, the devil is in the details here, and we recommend that people look at the prospectus or the regulatory documents for whatever investment product you're looking at, because it should be outlined what that company can invest in and won't invest in those documents. On the resource slide, we'll also, I'll point out a resource for you as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent question about the integration of different companies with the oil and gas industry. Our economy is so heavily integrated with the oil and gas industry, it's almost impossible to completely clean your hands of it. I'm sure most of us those of us not on bicycles, may have used oil and gas to get here. But we do tailored portfolios for people. We ask clients, what are your values? Is gender equity the most important thing? Toxic waste or oil and gas? And we did have a lady invested in a chemical company that passes all those different screens that we can find. And there's quite a network and a community in the socially responsible investing world. And I won't mention the name of the company, but it passes all the screens. But she got the annual report. She found they were selling compressed gas products. It was not natural gas, it was just compressed air and carbon into the oil and gas industry. So she requested that we pull that company, which was considered to be an extremely green company. So the search for a replacement company in the industrial field was very hard, because almost every time I found one that looked really clean and even had a green name, I could find some little tentacle of the oil and gas industry in it. So Green Citrus done a great job of kind of cleaning it up and keeping it heavily monitored. And there's a lot of pressure among all the different mutual funds and exchange-traded funds. They're being pushed more and more into fossil-free portfolios. So I think you're about to launch on their performance.
Sure. Yeah, and just one last follow-up. We obviously are dealing with the supply side of it and the production of fossil fuels. Some people are as strict and they don't want car companies. So again, it really is where each individual draws that line. So just some more comments on the performance of these types of investments. There's another academic study that has looked at similar broad-based portfolios, but U.S. domestic investments, looking at the S&P 500 versus a similar version, the same index without the energy sector in it. And again, there was very little performance impact, and that was over a 25-year period. So a few things to note. The energy sector is often 10 to 12% of our economy. So I think people find it hard. If you take out something that big a chunk of your investment pool, how can you still stay so close? And part of it is that the energy sector has been found to be among the most volatile sectors in our economy since 2005. And so removing that, you're removing potential risk in your portfolio by doing that. Essentially, as Bryan mentioned, fossil fuel free, broader SRI investment portfolios often track the market broadly. So if the market's going up, these funds and products are likely to be going up. If the market's going down, same with these products. Where you find slight over and underperformance is related to kind of whatever the main issue is. So in the fossil fuel free portfolios, during periods of outperformance of the fossil fuel free part, it's likely to be a period of low oil prices. When oil prices are higher, those companies are doing better and have the potential to slightly outperform. But the good news from our perspective is that these are pretty small over and underweights in terms of performance. And there's a quote up here by Morgan Stanley. Investing in sustainability has usually met and often exceeded the performance of comparable traditional investments. This is on both an absolute and a risk-adjusted basis across asset classes and over time. And the cynical side of me says these big international global investment firms don't get involved in these, what some people say is a niche part of the market, unless they see some value there, a growing market space, some investment performance to back it up.
So I think we're ready to throw it open to questions. We have one great question from the floor. Does anybody else have any? Lady back there?
Could you talk about how you actually do it? Like, say you're just out of college and you get your first job and your company's like, you have a 401k plan. You just sign up for it, never look at it. You just think it's some benefit you have, and so you do it. And I personally went into my 401k recently, and I found a resource online where you can book the ticker, and it tells you whether or not there's fossil fuels in it. And I went through every single one that my company offered in that 401k, and every single one had fossil fuels. And so, I wrote to my company to try to change that, but then in an IRA, for instance, where you have more choice, you can still only find 6 or 7 mutual funds maybe. And so then do you actually just pick stocks, individual stocks, of companies that you trust? I don't know.
So I'll repeat the question. I'm not sure the mic picked it up, but the question was an excellent one. She's invested in a 401k at work, and she went through the list of offerings, and there were no fossil fuel free or probably no SRI offerings in there. She pointed out that with an individually managed IRA, you have a lot more options. You should be able to find exchange traded funds or mutual funds or individual stocks. And I think the only thing to do is exactly what you did. I was in a situation very much like that. I was working with a conventional financial services firm, and we had a fund manager who actually had a high degree of expertise in socially responsible and fossil fuel funds. It was Mercer. And I kept writing to the company saying, well, why don't you offer this? The performance is the same, and there's a lot of demand for it. They never actually responded, so I left the company. But I think the thing to do is to talk with your colleagues who might be like-minded and keep writing to the administrator of the plan and to your company. Say, look, we're in Portland. There's a high degree of interest in environmental issues, particularly fossil fuel free, and there's great performance. Why don't you offer it? Erin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I might recommend if we could go to the resources slide as well. The website that you mentioned is the first one listed under online resources, fossilfreefunds.org. And you can type in the ticker symbol for a mutual fund, an ETF, an investment product, and it will bring up the percentage of exposure to fossil fuels. And if you only want to be out of coal, you can figure that out. There's a Dirty Dozen listing. There's a number of data points provided there. We also have created a piece about how to divest your portfolio. It's in this guide, but we had some handouts. I think they're gone, but I can share it with you. It's a step-by-step process, but essentially it's what you have done. It is talking to your employer, asking them to talk to the fund company or financial advisor who is helping them set up the plan. The biggest thing to know is that these options exist, and if the company that they're working with or the advisor either doesn't know about them or won't add an option, then it's one thing we recommend is trying to get other employee support. You know, if they hear it from one person, it might be hard for them to be motivated to change, but if they hear it from a lot of employees, knowing that they are interested. It's pretty easy in a retirement plan. You're not forcing anyone to pick this option. It's just adding an option for those who want it. So folks like Bryan can work with you. We can share the kind of list. There's the last website on there is for our industry trade group, the U.S. Social Investment Forum. And they have some online guides, including about dealing with retirement plans and questions you can ask of your employers.
Sandy, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. Two things I forgot to say when I was up there. One is I forgot to thank our volunteers tonight who are here. Linda, Bob there, Jennifer, Georgia. I just forgot to do that. I also forgot to say that when we beefed up our personal divestment page, we put a bunch of resources similar to these online resources, but they're similar, different, some the same, but that's another place you can look at. It's on the personal divestment page. I think we have about 10 or 12 different things on there under resources. We also have 2 sample letters. One is a letter that, you can download it and then put in the name of the fund you're in and, adapt it yourself. But one is made to be sent to a mutual fund and one is meant to be sent to a financial advisor, telling them that this is what you want. So that's another resource we have for you too.
Linda?
What is happening now with, is there progress in the bond mutual funds and bond ETFs? It's been easier to do equities than bonds, so what's happening with the fixed income?
Oh, that's a great question. Go ahead, and I'll jump in.
So we have, we're a 3 mutual fund family, so it's not huge. 2 are equity onlys, 1 has some bond exposure, so I will give you my very narrow take on what we have looked at in our portfolio. For us, so there's corporate bonds, there's agency bonds, and there's some intranational organization bonds. So from a company perspective, any screen we have on the equity side is applied to corporate bonds as well. So it's same, that same definition of fossil fuel that I gave before are screened out. From an agency perspective, we're in things like the World Bank has one of the first sustainability bonds. Corporations are starting now to do some sustainable specific bonds. Starbucks has one. Some of the car companies have one to help generate capital for their electric and hybrid vehicles. There's some international agency ones that are focused on, there's the Overseas Private Investment Corporation that is a U.S. private, public, governmental organization that backs bonds with the full faith and credit of the US government, but puts money into international development projects. One of ours in the fund is a solar project in Chile. So there are very specific green type bonds out there. Brian, you might, I don't know if you know more about the broader.
Yeah, if you'd asked that question 3 or 4 years ago, the answer would have been much narrower, but now there are other fund companies that have issued started green bond funds. There are no exchange-traded funds yet that I'm aware of. There has been a movement among municipalities, New York, and then your friend Jacqueline Dingfeller, when Charlie Hales was mayor, were looking at issuing specifically green municipal bonds. And a municipal bond is almost always going to be it's going to be more socially responsible than a corporate bond, just by definition. If you're building a library, expanding a library, it's probably going to be not doing any harm. But it's a pretty fast expanding world of green bonds, and I think we're going to see a lot more as well in the near future.
Have the Vanguards and the Fidelities and the Schwabs, I mean, have they got into this? I mean, I know it's a competitor of yours, but I mean, I would think, they got a million different. Yeah, right.
The answer to that is yes. In the last year, Vanguard and Fidelity have both started green funds. There are different shades of green, however, and if you are an active investor and you have particular concerns, it's a good idea to try to get a hold of the full listings, because you might find that their green bond or their green fund has a particular company in there that makes you cringe. TIA Craft, TIA now known as TIA, has both a green bond and a green equity fund. So there are more and more players getting into the market. I might also add, and I think it's a good time to introduce this subject, that companies like Green Century and Calvert and PAX, and Parnassus, some of the other large companies that have been in the socially responsible world for decades, or at least years, have another side to them, which is shareholder activism. And I meant to bring it up earlier, but Erin is somebody who, when she goes to Starbucks, she doesn't get a pumpkin latte. She gets them to change their policy on buying products that were raised with animals fed too many antibiotics. So she recently secured a huge victory on that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the shareholder advocacy part, which distinguishes some deeper green funds from some of the lighter green funds?
Sure, so, there's the whole investment part of having an impact and screening companies out or looking for better companies to invest in. And we kind of say, that's the investment side, and you end up with either this list of companies or this list of companies that you've invested in. But from a investor perspective, it's often hard to see, like, what's the secret sauce going into this? Why did this company make it in or that company not make it in? And it's a bit like we've described it as choosing a mechanic. At the end, you get your car back, whether, Joe or Bill or Sarah has worked on your car, and it's hard to know who did a better job of that. And so the other part of it is trying to have a more real-world, concrete, positive impact, and that's where we engage with companies to try to get them to improve their environmental performance. And this can take a lot of different incarnations. We work on policy issues. My colleagues in Boston just gave public testimony on a divestment issue in front of the Massachusetts State Legislature. I've testified at the San Francisco Retirement Employee Board. We'll write op-eds. But a lot of it is focused specifically on companies, and we start a dialogue. We share with the company our area of concern. Sometimes they make progress. Sometimes we never hear back from them. And so there's another tool called shareholder resolution. So as an investor, If you own $2,000 worth of company stock and you own it for a year, you can file a shareholder resolution that gets put on their proxy ballot. So all the other shareholders get to see it and vote on it. So that can often get management's attention, and then they suddenly start talking to us. And we can withdraw those resolutions if we make some progress. What Bryan was referring to at Starbucks, we were asking the company to not sell meat products that were raised with the routine use of antibiotics. And they made progress. They agreed not to sell poultry. And so we didn't file a shareholder resolution, but we asked them if we could go to their annual meeting anyway. And they were a little unsure because, that's not usually the protocol. But we had worked closely with them, and we said it's a chance to thank them for making this step and to encourage them to go further. So I had the pleasure of going with one of the colleagues from we were started by nonprofit environmental advocacy organizations. So a colleague in Washington and I went to the meeting, and it was kind of a star-studded affair. I didn't realize that they always have a musical guest at their annual meeting. Howard Schultz was extremely charismatic and dynamic, and their entire board of directors was there sitting amongst us. And during the Q&A portion, we were able to ask the first question. And it was more of a statement thanking Howard Schultz directly for taking this step and encouraging him to do more. Just outlining the issue about antibiotics in our food supply and the issues that raises. So it's a chance to get, very high exposure to management at these companies and hopefully make some change. It doesn't always go that easily, so sometimes it's a lot of work. But in the case of fossil fuels, we decided that advocacy isn't an effective tool, so that's why we took the divestment route.
Well, sometimes it can be somewhat effective.
Yeah.
I did have a client come to me who'd inherited a large portion of both Exxon and Chevron, and it was not in a retirement account. So if he'd simply divested, he would have had a crippling tax bill. So we worked with a group down in San Francisco called As You Sow, which has been specializing in this shareholder advocacy for decades, I guess, and co-sponsored one of these shareholder resolutions. And Exxon has been hit by a couple of pretty significant ones in the last 24 months. There was a shareholder resolution that passed requiring them to appoint a climate scientist to their board of directors, and they appointed a woman named Susan Avery. I've met her and seen her present. She's a former head of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Well, she's just fire. And so she's on their board now, and there was a resolution that passed by about 62.5% this year that required ExxonMobil to do a stress test of if the United States and all the other countries in the world adhere to the Paris Accords, limiting temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius, what would that do to Exxon business plan? Well, you can imagine. But this is a company that had been in total denial of climate change for decades. And so sometimes the shareholder advocacy does work even with these companies, but that's not what this group is more about. Other questions, please?
So, enjoying this conversation a great deal. What would Exxon do? What would she ask Exxon to do? This is a company that has huge worldwide holdings. How would they reinvest their capital? How would they reinvest their infrastructure?
Well,
Besides
I'll take a couple of things and pass it. I mean, BP, for example, which doesn't have a great environmental record, at one point was the largest investor in solar power in the world. I think they've shed that because they had so many other problems. Appointing a climate scientist to their board, doing a stress test. All the major European oil companies, by the way, did this same stress test before the Paris Accords, and those oil companies supported it. That was BP and Total and a couple of other people that have mixed environmental records. But actually, those stress tests were crucial to getting the Paris Accords endorsed, because it showed that there were people in the oil industry that did recognize the problem. What's your take on that?
Yeah, for some of it, these shareholder resolutions, the shareholders vote on it, so sometimes people focus on the actual percentage vote that these statements or questions are raising. I drew the short straw and had to present a shareholder resolution at Chevron a couple years ago, which was another fascinating kind of almost exact opposite of the Starbucks experience. It felt like a very militarized zone, which was kind of bizarre. But we were asking the company to stop making any political contributions, which, first of all, the reason we can do that, we don't own Chevron in any of our fossil fuel-free portfolios. As a management company, we own the smallest amount, so just over $2,000, solely for the purposes of engaging with these companies that won't pass our environmental screens. And this was more about working with, we partnered with Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth. We did a press conference outside the company headquarters. The vote was minimal, as you can imagine. 9%, I think, of shareholders supported this. But it was more about drawing attention to the issue. Chevron had a bad refinery explosion in the Bay Area in 2012, and it sent people in the headquarters town where they live. 5,000 people went to the hospital related to this air pollution issue. And so the city council imposed a fine. Chevron spent $3 million to endorse 4 candidates for this city council the next round. All 4 of them lost. And so purely in a slightly cynical way, we said that's a waste of shareholder money. But again, it's about the influence and control that these companies have. So I think a lot of it is just multiple tactics and trying to raise awareness of these issues, how these companies are operating, in our political process and beyond.
Thanks, Erin. Any other questions out there? Yes, please.
Erin, you mentioned the South Africa apartheid divestment campaign, which was a peaceful, successful campaign. And currently there's a BDS campaign for Israel, which is a peaceful movement for the Middle East, for peace in Palestine, Israel. So, and there's an odd, it's becoming illegal in this country. There are people that are so opposed to it, they're trying to make that whole divestment campaign illegal. So I have 2 sort of related questions. One, have you all looked into any of that divestment campaign, and has the fossil fuel one received any antagonistic efforts?
I'm not aware. We have not participated in some of the international ones that you've mentioned. We're certainly aware of them, and investors bring them up to us. 2 of our portfolios track an index, and so a lot of it's similar to that MSCI index. There's a kind of strict methodology of what the process is to evaluate companies and what gets into the portfolio or not. One of our portfolios is actively managed, and so we have more control there in terms of issues and types of companies to invest in, but we haven't currently focused on those issues. I kind of describe us as, I mentioned ESG as kind of being capital E, with a focus more so on the environmental issues, certainly on our engagement side, but across the portfolio kind of split evenly between environmental, social, and governance factors. Bryan, I'm not sure if you know anything additional.
What was the second part of the question? What was, I have encountered that question a couple of times, and I haven't found any funds that screen on that issue, to be honest. One reason is that, again, most of the companies are so tightly integrated into the economy. I mean, Intel's got a huge research facility in Tel Aviv, I believe. So, I'm sorry, we haven't really answered your question, but
Well,
we
the
did.
second part was, is the fossil fuel divestment getting any opposition?
Well,
Again, I'm not aware specifically. I'm sure they are.
Yep,
I don't know if you know.
Well, let me give you a slightly indirect. We've talked a little bit about shareholder advocacy, and I think that is, and I think both the divestment and the shareholder advocacy are having an effect, a bite. The current Congress has, the House of Representatives has passed something called the Financial Choice Act, which would greatly restrict our ability to file shareholder resolutions. Instead of $2,000 worth of a company for 1 year, they would require you to hold, I think it's 3% of the company, which is, say, in the case of Wells Fargo, which is the company I think we can all agree could use a little advice on how to treat their customers. That would be something like, I think it was $23 billion, and there are only 3 financial services companies in the whole world that could actually afford that. So, yeah, we can feel the punch going in a little bit. It's a little bit hard to measure, but we can see the reaction. By the way, that bill, I've talked to Elizabeth Warren's staff in Boston, and I've talked to Senator Wyden himself and his staff. It doesn't look like that bill is going anywhere in the Senate for various reasons. Yes.
So, there was a question about the 401K. My personal situation is I've never worked a traditional job, so all of my retirement fund is, I've kind of had to figure out how to manage it on my own. And, my stepdad is a genius when it comes to investing money, so I've kind of taken his lead. And I'm using the same financial advisor that he uses, but I'll just tell you, they live in the panhandle of Texas, if that tells you anything. So
That's where my dad was from, too.
So I feel really strongly about, having my money be where my values are. So I don't know, can you give me some advice on how to begin sort of untangling myself from this heavy ideology of how to invest and start kind of moving the ship over to something that is more in line with my values? And, I'm getting close to retirement, so I can't afford to, and I don't know if there's gonna be any Social Security for me. So how should I try to start untangling all this?
Let me address the issue of Social Security first.
Can you repeat questions? So that
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, so her question is that she hadn't held a job with a 401K, and she's been doing all the investing, the retirement savings on her own, and been working with a financial advisor from the panhandle of Texas. Was it Lubbock or Hereford or?
Pampa.
Pampa, okay, which is not exactly oil country, but they're deeply conservative. So how does she get disentangled from this? And she also worried about Social Security. So it's not a Social Security lecture, but Social Security is probably not as in much danger as sometimes advertised. That we continue until 2034, I believe, without any potential reduction in benefits. And there are several fixes that are possible, that are not that complicated, that are politically a little bit difficult right now, that will extend Social Security for quite a while. So I wouldn't say that was that explosive. But in terms of getting disentangled, I've got a paper back there that I wrote, a white paper on socially responsible investing. So I personally deal with that all the time. If the money is in a retirement account, you can move it without any tax consequence, as long as you don't remove it from the retirement area, IRA or a Roth or a 401K. If it's invested and it's not a retirement account, then you have to be extremely cautious about incurring tax penalties. And I'd be happy to talk with you in a little more depth.
You need a new advisor, is the answer.
Erin, do you have any thoughts on that?
And my only thought is to ask them questions. And there are resources, maybe on US SIF, but I'm sure I can find some others about specifics about socially responsible investing or the issues that you care most deeply about. we've had financial advisors say, a client just asked me about this and I Googled and Green Century came up. Like, what do you do? What is this? I don't understand any of it. So, you know, sometimes they're willing to learn. I'm not sure that they're learning all that much by Googling, but there are professionals like Bryan out there who focus solely on this and know, you know, we're one of the options, but there's lots of other options that, and he knows whether we're appropriate for you or some other investment vehicle. So that's the biggest thing, along with kind of the workplace retirement and options. Like, some of these advisors don't know about it, and therefore, you know, the performance issue is the first thing they're gonna throw out. You know, so it's just knowing how to stay the course and, you know, find what you're looking for.
Thank you.
Sure. Bob, I might recommend we at least scroll through the disclosure slides so we don't get in trouble. There's one more too.
So
Thank you.
also I wanted to ask people that we have an evaluation form, seminar evaluation form. So if you do have questions, specific questions you want, we have an evaluation form that's being passed around. If you have specific questions on fossil fuel investing or socially responsible investing, we would be happy to follow up with you. Also, there's again, a repeat and sign-up sheet at the back. If you want to receive an electronic copy of the extraction guide, it's a very authoritative guide. It should answer a lot of questions and might raise some questions, and feel free to follow up with us. So, you've been very patient. I want to thank 350 and also the Sandy and Tara and all the volunteers that have worked so hard to put this together. Also Joe for videotaping it. And thank you all for taking time on a very beautiful evening to come listen to a very dry subject. There's a lot of commitment in Portland, and we really admire it. Is there any other questions before we sign off?
Are we sure there's no more questions? I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm pretty ignorant about this stuff, but I do know that there's, for example, a company, or your people, I'm assuming, do a lot more, let's see, investigation of green companies and things like that. So could we, or could I expect that because of that, what you charge would be proportional to the amount of effort you put into, let's say, the fee you charge, is that the proper word? And I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying, because I have started looking, and it's a lot of work. Even looking up the number, the index numbers.
So the question is about the fees that we charge, and we almost always get that question. Well, I think of us a little bit like, you know, the organic farmers that you meet at the farmers market. We're working in the fields here, and we're doing our part to try to build a new economy, the fossil fuel and environmentally friendly economy with clean technologies. And frankly, I can find solutions that are less expensive for you, but you don't quite get the amount of research or activism as you would otherwise. Erin?
I would echo that. You know, the indexes that we track and the actively managed sub-advisor that we work with all have dedicated staff that evaluate not only the financial, but the environmental, social performance of these companies. The other piece of it that we talked about before was the active engagement. There are other funds that track some of these same MSCI indexes for lower fee, but they do no active engagement. So we have 11 people on staff, 2 in a portion are full-time shareholder advocates, one of whom traveled to Indonesia 2 months ago to follow up on commitments that we had gotten from palm oil companies to stop deforestation. So it's the kind of on-the-ground, in-person focus on these issues. So it does often lead to a higher fee than a traditional straight fund. The one thing that we are trying to do, there's extreme fee pressure throughout the industry. So we have started to open up not only an investor retail class of shares, but an institutional class. The institutional class is open to anyone. Of course, it's a much higher investment minimum, but it is a lower fee. So the investment minimum on the regular share classes is $2,500 or $1,000 for an IRA. For the institutional share class, it's $250,000. But again, there's these nuances in the investment field. Fidelity, if you invest through Fidelity, their minimum is $100,000. So they only apply that minimum, not our minimum. So there's nuances like that. I don't believe Schwab applies the minimums.
I don't think Schwab has a green fund yet.
Yeah, so, but some of our funds that are available and some of the other fund families that have their funds on these platforms. But you're right, yeah, it is an expensive, more in-depth look at investing.
Okay. Any more questions? We don't want to leave any stone unturned here. Yes?
Just one more, I think at some point you mentioned, looking at a mutual fund and, seeing the list of companies that it's invested in to really be able to understand. My understanding is that that could like change on a daily basis.
That's true. The best you can do is a quarterly report. So if you go to their website, you can see the annual report, which doesn't usually have the list. The December annual report almost always then would be your fallback, would have the list. So if you bash around on a company's website or a mutual fund's website, you should be able to find a quarterly report, which would be a pretty good reflection of what's in the fund.
And just one other piece to that is trying to take a look, it's probably the driest document in the world, but like if it's a mutual fund, the prospectus, like you, hopefully in the table of contents, you can find a smaller section to read through about their investment strategy and their screens. And that's where you should be able to see some of the guidelines of what they're willing to invest in and what they won't invest in. And that's a more, they have to follow those guidelines per the SEC. So some don't get very specific, so again, it's hard, but you can call and talk to them and they should be able to elucidate if fossil fuels is your main issue or any other issue.
Sandy?
I think one of the resources that we have on our personal investment page is, I'm not sure if it's Go Fossil Free or where, but there has been a website where you can where they have the ratings for various.
I think we had that on the resource page. It was a Go Fossil Fuel Free.
Is that the one?
Yeah. If you back up.
Which is from, it's from
There we go.
350
The first one on the.
350.org.
Yep.
Yeah,
I think that-
and they have a place where you can put in the
Oh, I'm
name
sorry,
of
second
the
one.
fund you're interested in, and they'll give you that information on it.
Yes.
This might have been something you said already, but I'm going to ask it. I have a certain amount of money to invest, but it's not a lot. It's definitely, it's under $50,000. Would that be out for most of these funds?
No, that, I'm sure we could find a home for it. So, we could find it, what we do is, for example, we ask people, we give them a questionnaire, like what's important to you. Some people don't want to invest in tobacco or alcohol. Other people think, well, that's a personal choice, but just want to be clean on the environmental. So I'm sure there's places where we could find a home for that.
So do you have options that are a little more straightforward, like if you have money invested that you can just roll over something into a similar but fossil fuel free or sustainable, whatever? In other words, whether it's investing from here forward or whether taking what you have and not being able to deal with it within the program that it's in, could it just be completely removed and just start
Yeah,
with?
the question is, can a amount of money that's invested in a non-socially responsible way be moved into a socially responsible investment? There is no reason it can't be. The tricky part is just to make sure that you avoid a tax penalty, because you could have a capital gain on a large amount of money, but if you have a lot of money
Well,
saved.
I mean, are there like things to put it into, so an IRA, you know, traditional versus a Roth or a whatever, you've got different options, you could roll them into a like type thing.
Yeah, definitely. So a fund family like ours has only 3 investment options, but folks like Bryan know, okay, if they can map yours, if you want to stay in similar asset classes and similar types of products, can map it to find what's most similar with the least tax implications and all that sort of stuff. You know, if you go to the fund family, specifically, we have kind of off-the-shelf options, which may or may not appeal, but, you know, working with a financial advisor, if you have those types of questions, they can understand what your goals are, you know, more so than firms like ours.
So we'll hang around and answer any other questions of individuals for a little while, but it looks like there's a general trend to hit the road. So thank you all very much. Thank you, 350, and thanks to all of our volunteers. Thank you.